At 09:56 hours, this Ukrainian MiG-29 was climbing through 1,000 feet toward Ordokiv. Its mission was to destroy this Russian ammo depot. The flight had been routine for 12 minutes, but unknown to the pilot, an S-400 near Melitopol had just locked him up at 120 kilometers. The steady tone in the pilot's headset hit like a punch to the gut. The missile was already climbing, 180 kilometers of explosive bad news accelerating past Mach 2 in its first second of flight. At this range, impact in 80 seconds, maybe 90 if he gets lucky. The pilot yanked the stick hard right while simultaneously deploying chaff, putting the MiG into a 90-degree aspect angle to the radar beam, what pilots call notching. He held the perpendicular heading for 8 seconds while dispensing chaff in program bursts. The aluminum strips created a slowly expanding cloud moving at wind speed, each strip reflecting radar energy like thousands of tiny mirrors that made one aircraft look like 100. The system's algorithms tried to sort fighter from false returns from terrain, but at this aspect angle, they all looked identical. Track quality degraded from solid to intermittent to lost. The 4.8N6 missile, suddenly without guidance updates, switched to its backup mode, flying toward the last predicted intercept point. But the pilot had already changed course and was diving for the deck. Missile's onboard seeker activated in the terminal phase, searching for a target that was now 2 kilometers away and obscured by chaff. Its proximity fuse found nothing but aluminum rain. The warhead detonated harmlessly, sending shrapnel through the empty sky. The reason why this worked is because the S-400's radar uses Doppler processing to separate moving targets from ground clutter. It looks for things like approaching or receding, measuring the frequency shift of the radar return. But when you fly perpendicular to the radar, your relative velocity toward or away from it becomes zero. To the Doppler processor, you suddenly look like terrain, which is why the missile missed. The pilot leveled off at 500 feet, checking his 6. The missile's smoke trail disappeared in the morning air, but he knew this was just round 1. That's because the Russian Gravestone radar uses thousands of individual transmitter-receiver modules that can steer their beam electronically, jumping from horizon to zenith instantly. And unlike older systems that give up when they lose track, this one remembers. It knows your last position, your heading, your speed. It calculates where you probably went and starts searching there first. The pilot had bought himself maybe 30 seconds. The Gravestone operators were already adapting by switching to different radar modes. That's when they activated bistatic mode, and suddenly this pilot's clever escape became a trap. In bistatic mode, the radar splits itself in two. The transmitter stays at the original site near Melitopol, but the receiver sits 40 kilometers away at a different angle. Think of it like this. Normally, radar is like a flashlight where the bulb and your eyes are in the same place. Bistatic mode puts the flashlight in one location while you watch from across the room. Suddenly, you can see shadows and reflections that were invisible before. The MiG's radar warning receiver only detected the transmitter signal hitting him, but had no idea a receiver 40 kilometers away was catching his reflection like a mirror catching sunlight around a corner. The geometry meant that even at 500 feet below the primary radar's horizon, the signal bounced off his aircraft and traveled to the offset receiver from a completely different angle. The return was weak, intermittent, but it was enough. They had him again. This time, they didn't launch immediately. They had something better in mind. At 10:03 hours, this Buck M3 got the information they needed. The crew had been waiting for the plane to reach this exact spot, a slight rise overlooking the valley the MiG would transit in 90 seconds. They didn't need to search. The S-400 had already told them everything. Altitude 500 feet, speed 480 knots, heading 067, arriving in 85 seconds. The automated systems took over with mechanical precision. The 9S-36M radar went from cold to radiating in 3 seconds. Its phased array already pointed at the exact bearing where the MiG would appear. This wasn't random hunting. This was an execution. The S-400's computers had calculated not just where the target was, but where it would be, accounting for terrain masking, fuel consumption, even pilot psychology. Ukrainian pilots always followed the same valley through this sector because it offered the best cover. Today, that predictability should have been the end of him. The pilot's radar warning receiver exploded with alarms. Buck acquisition, signal strength maximum, track mode achieved. He'd been ambushed, and at this range, he had maybe 4 seconds before missiles launched. The geometry was perfect for the Russians. He was trapped in a valley with ridgelines on both sides. Couldn't dive because he'd hit the ground. Couldn't climb without exposing himself to every SAM within 50 kilometers. The Buck had him in a box where none of the options were good ones. 2 9M317M missiles erupted from their tubes, accelerating so fast they broke the sound barrier before clearing the tree line. Each missile weighed 690 kilograms and pulled 35 Gs in the terminal phase, turns that he couldn't hope to outrun. The pilot watched them climb on his missile warning system, calculating intercept geometry. At current speed and altitude, impact in 31 seconds. But here's what made the Buck truly terrifying. Unlike older systems where you could break lock and the missile went stupid, these things used command guidance until the last second. The ground radar fed them constant updates. Breaking lock meant nothing. The missiles would keep coming. The pilot had one option that might work, and it would hurt. He pulled the stick into his stomach while ramming the throttles forward, trading all his carefully hoarded energy for altitude. The MiG rocketed upward in a maximum performance climb. G-meter pegging at 7.5. At this load, the aircraft weighed 7.5 times normal. Pilot's G-suit inflated, squeezing his legs and abdomen to keep him conscious, but gray started creeping in from the edges of his vision anyway. Through the narrowing tunnel, he watched his altitude, 2,000 feet, 3,000, 4,000. At 4,500 feet, he fired every chaff cartridge he had while rolling inverted and pulling through. The MiG traced a perfect barrel roll while aluminum strips created a radar snowstorm. The first missile tried to follow the radical maneuver, but couldn't match the roll rate. It passed 100 meters below, close enough that the pilot could see his control fins working. The second missile was smarter. Its guidance computer predicted where the MiG would be at the bottom of the roll. But the pilot had anticipated this. Instead of completing the roll, he pushed negative Gs halfway through, bunting toward the ground in an opposite direction. The missile corrected, but too late. It overshot by 200 meters, proximity fuse finding nothing but chaff. He'd survived, but the maneuver had cost him. Fuel consumption during max afterburner climb, 300 kilograms in 40 seconds. His airspeed had dropped to 180 knots, barely above stall speed with the weapons still attached. And the Buck crew wasn't done. They were already reloading. The 9T-243 transport vehicle backed up to the launcher, its crane already swinging a fresh missile into position. The crew had drilled this evolution hundreds of times, muscle memory and mechanical precision. The pilot would still be in range, still be slow from his defensive maneuvering, still be vulnerable. The commander watched the automated loading sequence while tracking the MiG on his screen. The Ukrainian was climbing toward release altitude. He needed 15,000 feet for the GBU-39s to achieve maximum glide range. That climb would take 90 seconds. The reload would be complete in 45. The fourth missile launched just as the pilot reached 14,000 feet, followed immediately by a fourth. But the crew had made a critical error. They'd fired both simultaneously instead of staggered. It seems like a small mistake, but in air combat, small mistakes determine who goes home. Both missiles would arrive at the same moment, creating a single defensive problem instead of two sequential ones. The pilot held his course for 12 agonizing seconds, letting the weapon's GPS receivers acquire satellites and download weather data. The GBU-39s needed this for initial positioning. Without it, they'd be nothing more than expensive dumb bombs. At 14 seconds, with missiles closing at 4 times the speed of sound, he pickled both weapons. The GBU-39 separated cleanly, their wings deploying as he rolled inverted and pulled toward the Earth. 7 Gs crushed him down as the missiles tried to follow. But physics is absolute. A missile traveling at Mach 4 needs almost 2 kilometers to make a 180-degree turn, like a freight train trying to follow a motorcycle that just made a U-turn. The MiG could flip directions in 200 meters while the missiles, carrying all that hypersonic momentum, carved enormous arcs through the sky trying to come back around. Both 9 M317Ms overshot, their proximity fuses triggering on empty air as they sailed past where the MiG had been 3 seconds ago. The pilot leveled off at 8,000 feet, checking fuel, 1,850 kilograms. The extreme maneuvering had burned through his reserves. He had enough to reach Ukrainian airspace if he flew straight and level, if he didn't light the afterburners again, and if nobody else engaged him. That's exactly when his threat receiver picked up something new. Search radar from an Su-35S bearing 240, range 85 kilometers and closing fast. The fighter had been vectored by the same network that had guided the buck. This wasn't random interception. This was coordinated hunting, and he was the prey. The Su-35 saw the MiG on his Irbis E radar as a bright dot crawling across his display at pathetic speed, 280 knots, barely moving. The Russian pilot pushed his throttles forward, accelerating through 500 knots. At this closure rate, he'd be in missile range in 3 minutes. The Ukrainian pilot had survived the S-400, defeated the Buck, but those victories had cost him everything. He had no speed, minimal fuel, and no more tricks. The Su-35 you see barreling towards him now was everything the MiG-29 wasn't. Modern, powerful, and designed to intercept beyond visual range. The aircraft's radar could track 30 targets simultaneously while engaging 8, and right now it was focused on just one. The Ukrainian fighter appeared on his screen in perfect detail. Altitude 8,000 feet and decreasing. Speed now down to 270 knots, heading 247 degrees toward home. At 60 kilometers, the Su-35 achieved lock with an R-77 active radar missile. The weapon would fly 110 kilometers, but at that range, the probability of intercept dropped below 50%. Better to close to make sure. But the Ukrainian pilot faced an impossible calculation. He needed to maintain his airspeed or risk running dry over Russian-controlled territory. It was like standing in a duel while your opponent walked closer for a better shot. The R-77 launch came at 55 kilometers. The Russian pilot watched the missile drop from his pylon, motor igniting a half-second later in a burst of white flame. The weapon accelerated past Mach 4, its active seeker head already tracking independently while the data link provided mid-course updates. Time to impact, 47 seconds. The Ukrainian pilot waited until the last possible moment to make his move. What happened next shouldn't have been possible. The MiG's nose climbed through 30 degrees, 40, 50, 60, airspeed bleeding away like water from a punctured bag. At 70 degrees nose up and 180 knots, barely flying, the pilot kicked full rudder. The aircraft's nose rotated past vertical while the fuselage continued forward, essentially stopping in midair like someone had grabbed it with an invisible hand. The R-77's guidance computer had been programmed to intercept aircraft, not levitating metal sculptures. Its algorithms tried to calculate an intercept solution for something that had effectively zero forward velocity. Failed. Tried again. Failed again. By the time it settled on simply flying toward the last known position, the MiG had fallen through its trajectory. The missile overshot by 300 meters, proximity fuse finding nothing but empty sky. The Russian couldn't believe it. The Ukrainian had deliberately stalled his aircraft at 8,000 feet to defeat a missile. Now the MiG tumbled earthward, completely energy depleted, nose hunting for flying airspeed like a brick looking for ground. The Ukrainian had recovered at 5,000 feet and was now diving for the deck as the GBUs continued their way to the target. But the Su-35 had all the advantages now. He climbed to 20,000 feet and rolled inverted, looking down through his canopy at the struggling MiG below. From up here, he owned every option, while the Ukrainian had none. The MiG couldn't climb to meet him, no energy. Couldn't dive, too low. Couldn't turn, no speed. It was like watching a wounded animal try to run on a broken leg. The Russians selected an R-73 infrared missile for the close-range hit. No radar warning for this one. The seeker was completely passive, tracking engine heat. The dive attack was textbook. The Russian pilot pushed over from his perch, accelerating through 600 knots as gravity became his ally. The MiG pilot could only watch him grow larger in the mirrors. At 4 kilometers, he fired. The R-73 leapt off the rail, its imaging infrared seeker locked onto the MiG's hot exhaust. But the Ukrainian had one last card. He pointed his nose straight up and fired every flare he had. The magnesium pellets erupted in a climbing spiral, each one burning at 2,000 degrees Celsius, creating a wall of heat that overwhelmed the missile's simple seeker logic. The R-73 chose the brightest source and flew straight through the flare pattern, missing the MiG by 50 meters. The Su-35 pulled out of its dive, overshooting again. His fuel state was becoming a factor. Another 5 minutes and he'd have to disengage. The Ukrainian pilot used those seconds to nose over and run for the deck, engines at military power, racing toward Ukrainian airspace now just 75 kilometers away. But first, he had to survive what was waiting at Orikhiv. At 10:14 hours, the MiG pilot skimmed across farmland at 50 feet, engine coughing on the last dregs of fuel, when tracers erupted from a tree line ahead. A ZSU Shilka had been waiting exactly here, positioned by the same air defense network that had orchestrated everything else. 4 23mm cannons firing 850 rounds per minute each. Radar-guided, effective range 2.5 kilometers. At this altitude, this airspeed, the geometry meant he'd fly straight through the stream in 2 seconds. The pilot didn't think. Thinking took too long. He rolled inverted and pulled, flying upside down at -G just meters above the ground. The cannon rounds passed overhead, so close he could hear them crack past the canopy. The Shilka gunner, surprised by the inverted approach, cranked his turret down, walking the stream of tracers toward the MiG. But tracking an inverted target at 50 feet meant the radar kept trying to lock onto the ground return. The system hunted between aircraft and Earth, confused. 3 rounds punched through the vertical stabilizer anyway, 2 more through the right wing. Warning lights illuminated across the panel, hydraulic pressure dropping, flight controls degrading to manual reversion. The stick now fighting him like it was connected to the control surfaces with concrete instead of cables. But he was through, trailing smoke and hydraulic fluid, but still flying. Behind him, the Shilka crew radioed his position to every unit in the sector. Let someone else finish him. The pilot checked his instruments through the forest of warning lights. 90 kilograms of fuel, 35 kilometers to friendly lines, engine temperature climbing into the red from damage, oil pressure dropping. The math said he'd make it, but he needed 30 more seconds. At 0:10:15, 8 kilometers behind him, the first GBU-39 reached the battalion command post. The weapon had flown for 6 minutes through GPS jamming, guided only by inertial navigation and pre-programmed waypoints. The uncooled infrared seeker activated in the final seconds, identifying the building's heat signature against the cooler background. The bomb adjusted its flight path one last time, diving through the roof at 70 degrees. The GBU-39's intelligent fuse counted layers: steel roof, insulation, concrete, then detonated its 16 kilograms of AFX-757 explosive exactly in the center of the operations room. The blast deleted everything in 0.003 seconds. Maps showing the Provosk offensive turned to ash. Radios coordinating 2,000 troops vaporized. The brain of the Russian advance ceased to exist. A fraction of a second later, the second bomb found the ammunition bunker. This was the real target. 500 tons of 152mm shells, grad rockets, and mortar rounds packed into a space designed for 300. The bomb's penetrator punched through 3 feet of reinforced concrete before the fuse triggered. The chain reaction built exponentially. Each 152mm shell contained 8 kilograms of TNT. Each grad rocket, 20 kilograms of high explosive. The thermal pulse from one triggered the next, in a cascade that turned the bunker into a volcano. The concrete roof contained the blast for exactly 0.1 seconds before disintegrating. The pilot crossed into Ukrainian airspace at 10:17 with every warning light illuminated, engine temperature beyond red, into territory the gauge didn't have colors for. 30 kilograms of fuel, hydraulics failed, controls barely responding. The forward airstrip materialized through the haze 3 kilometers ahead. No time for patterns or procedures. He lowered the gear manually with the emergency pneumatic system. 2 clunks from the mains, nothing from the nose. The runway rushed up at 180 knots. He held the nose off as long as possible, main wheels touching, bouncing, then touching again. The nose gear finally dropped and locked just before the nose would have struck the pavement. The engines flamed out as he turned onto the taxiway, turbine spinning down with the grinding sound of metal on metal. The aircraft rolled to a stop 50 meters from the maintenance hangar, leaking fluids, smoking, with more holes than Swiss cheese, but home. Bye for now.